Talk about a police issue that you've been heavily involved in. The defund the police movement is kind of a buzzword that people use. Yeah. In your situation, you explain exactly what you did that some of your critics have said is defund the police, that I think probably takes a little bit of a nuanced discussion to really explain.
Yeah, absolutely will. In Kansas City, as the people of St. Louis will remember too, we have a state requirement of how much we put into our police department. We followed that. That's 20%. That leaves an extra $40 million. This year we decided as a city council to try to work with the Board of Police Commissioners on how they're spending that money. So we introduced and passed an ordinance that allows all that money, actually requires any of that money go back to the Board of Police Commissioners, the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. But we wanted to work with things like prevention, like community services, like our crisis intervention team officers. All those things that our police department does that so many neighborhood people say are important. Because when you look at policing, it's dealing often these days with people in crisis. It's dealing with folks in tough domestic situations. And so we wanted to make sure that we had money that was targeted to that area. So rather than just being some huge cut, as some people tried to allege, anybody who's actually read into it in Kansas City recognizes that it is actually making sure certain things are performed in Kansas City, making sure we get that neighborhood policing, making sure we have the mental health community services involvement, all done, by the way, through the Kansas City Police Department. This is not shifting to Truman Medical Center here. This is not shifting to the Quinton Lucas Cares About This Issue Fund. And that's where I think the more we've been able to discuss it, folks get it. Folks say, you know what, we like crisis intervention trained officers. We like making sure we have folks that are working in victim services at KCPD. And I think that's something that is going to do well for Kansas City long term.
I've talked to several of your officers before we visited. And, you know, some of them weren't happy with the optics of it.
Sure.
But their take was this. I heard one of your officers had a really nuanced take. He said if you send a social worker to a crime scene, you're going to have a dead social worker.
That's right.
But if you send a social worker to the jail after a 48-hour hold and you help a person, not just say, you know, do better, but if you help them, a lot of problems with mental health, identify those, get the health care treatment they need, maybe help them get a job. You really, I know there's a rural community that takes folks, and if you're over 28, you're in trouble for the second or third time, they'll actually take you with a social worker and help you get a place to live. There's an element for these things. Maybe it's not what some folks think. You're just going to send social workers out with guns to be shot. There is a way to help folks, so maybe you only have to arrest them once and not 4 times in 3 years.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, last Friday I was in Springfield with Mayor Ken McClure, spent time with the Springfield Police Department and at the Burrell Behavioral Health Center. And we talked about that very thing, how for Springfield PD, they're trying to get their officers back into the streets. And instead of, say, sending that same person to the Greene County Jail 25 different times, if you can get them picked up by one of our officers, why it's still important that they are involved. And the officer has a place to send them to get services. The officer has a place to say that, all right, you can take care of this person, make sure they're on their medication, what have you. That really saves us law enforcement time. That saves us costs long term in terms of corrections. It is vital for us. And that's what we're trying to do a better job of in Kansas City. You know, ever since I became mayor, we have invested heavily in the social worker program, but through the Kansas City Police Department, because they are not separate. When you show up to a scene and you see a lot of issues, you see maybe there was a homicide or something of that sort, and there's a 10-year-old there. We want to make sure that somebody's working with that kid long term. That's what we're talking about. You know, I think those who tried to say it's defunding, first of all, had political reasons to do it, but I've seen cities that did that. And that is just taking money out of the budget, putting it in something different, never goes back to policing. Yep. That's not the Kansas City story, and that's not something that this mayor would support as long as I'm in office.
Okay, you have some folks from the Northland.
Oh, yeah.
Republicans.
Yep.
Now I understand politics is part of everything. Criticizing folks. If you can't be criticizing politics, you shouldn't be in it. But what would you say to someone that maybe not called for a special, but somebody that has serious concerns? Yeah. I would doubt that if a legislator called you, you wouldn't sit down and talk to him.
Oh, I would sit down and talk to anybody who would call me. I think it's kind of the joy of this job. It seems tough sometimes, but it's actually fun. I've had a relationship with Tony Lutkemeyer since we were both younger lawyers and kind of operating in a different field than politics. And so while we probably disagree on this issue and several others, I would absolutely sit down and say, I think this enhances funding for the Kansas City Police Department. Our ordinances allow us to hire a new recruiting class. And we all have the same fundamental goal, which is to stop seeing young boys and young girls killed on the streets of Kansas City, St. Louis, so many other communities. And I hope we can come together, at least on some of these issues, and see how we can do it. Once you get past the rhetoric, I think there are ways to get that done.